Protests in the city of Santiago are ramping up on the west coast of the United States. I caught up with KPBS reporter Max Rivlin-Nadler for an update.
There's been an escalation of protests, which really crested over the weekend. The city of San Diego was a few days behind the rest of the country. It's not quite known for being at the forefront of the protest movement. There have been protests here in the past, specifically over border enforcement and policing, but not on the size and scale that we've seen over the weekend for some time. So on Sunday, there was a large protest downtown. The day before that, on Saturday, there was one in La Mesa, which is a city right next door, essentially pretty much the same metropolitan area. And these were thousands of people who were peacefully protesting for hours at a time. They were, of course, driven to the streets by what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis, but also other events that have impacted the African-American community here, including the death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, and a recent event here in San Diego where a young black man was at a transit stop and was repeatedly shoved by a white police officer as he was waiting to meet his friends. So this was building for some time, and sure enough, it crested with a large amount of people peacefully protesting. Eventually, though, several hours after the protest began, it was met with a response by police that included tear gas, pepper spray, and essentially tools to disperse them that went well beyond what the protesters were capable of presenting a threat to the police.
Now, Max, your president, Donald Trump, is referring to these as acts of domestic terror. Is that what you're witnessing?
That seems to be a legal term. I'll tell you what I see is that there are people who are unarmed, who have shown up for protests for the past several days in American streets. I'm talking 95% of these protesters come to march peacefully. The people that I've seen using the most violence in general against other people have been the police officers using tear gas and things like that on the people who just came out for a protest. We saw today outside of the White House, unfortunately, a pretty ugly scene where people were chased out of a plaza. They had not been throwing any rocks or anything, any water bottles, chased out of the plaza across from the White House by police officers. So I wouldn't say that there aren't people who are engaging in the protests who have engaged in violence. That's very clear. There are people who've broken store windows. There are people who have taken merchandise, and there are people who've shoved back when a police officer shoves them. In terms of a terror threat, I think American people and the American cities have probably faced tougher challenges.
And Max, we're in the height of this coronavirus pandemic, and of course the United States, the worst affected of any country. Has there been any links to a surge in COVID-19 cases throughout America, or is that being put very much on the back burner because of these escalation in riots and so forth?
It's really tough to tell. We haven't had that kind of 2-week incubation period yet. Obviously, this being an outdoor setting, it's, from what we know of the disease, it's much harder to transmit, but people are in close quarters. People are touching one another. It's not the behavior that we saw a few months ago, but it is very similar to the behavior that we saw among protesters who had come out, a lot of them in support of the president, to try to end stay-at-home orders in American cities. Those protests themselves also didn't necessarily lead to an uptick in coronavirus cases.
And we're up to the 7th day of protests in relation to this matter. How do you see this being resolved, Max? Are you thinking that it's starting to abate, it's starting to quieten down, or is there a suggestion that there could be a second wave of protests coming?
We don't know, really. I mean, it's tough to read what happened this afternoon at the White House as anything but essentially a provocation to people who are upset with the way that both the federal and local governments have been handling this. In San Diego, where I'm based, the local police department announced that it would be no longer practicing a controversial chokehold that it had done for several years. And people had been really protesting against this for years and years, and the police officers here, insisted that they needed this for their safety. But in response to the protest, they've dropped that practice. And that's being replicated across the country. In New York State, legislators are thinking about repealing a law that blocks police officers' identities who've been accused of misconduct. Whether that's actually going to be enough to stop what people are reacting to remains to be seen, because again, what they're reacting to is not only the act of violence against people of color by police, but also kind of the economic situation that we've seen in the United States, where we are experiencing a huge economic downturn. It's been several months now where people have not been able to get steady paychecks. And you've seen city budgets get slashed and social services get slashed. So this is entering a really nasty feedback loop that we're going to have to keep an eye on. I think this is a confluence of issues that are arising to these protests